Welcome back to day 2 of the Ogden Sewalong. Today we're going to start sewing. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to stay stitch the curved edges along the top of the Ogden on both the main and the lining pieces. This keeps it from stretching out during construction. We're going to do this at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. That is an 1/8 of an inch inside of the normal 1/2 of an inch seam allowance so that it's not visible. Once you switched out your sewing machine needle and your thread and everything on your machine are ready to go, you're going to start stitching. Once again, this is at a 3/8 of a seam allowance. You're going to start at the top and go down to the bottom, and you're going to do this on your lining and also your main pattern pieces for your Ogden. Once you're done, it should look like this. So once again, it's on your main pattern pieces and also both of your lining pattern pieces. Now, if you are sewing up the 14 to 30 version of the Ogden, you do need to go ahead and sew your darts at this point. So what I like to do is with right sides touching, I'm going to match up those dart legs, and you do that all the way to the point. I like to go ahead and put a couple pins in it so it doesn't shift at all when I'm stitching it. And then we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch from the wide area of the dart all the way to the point, and you do not back stitch at the very end. When I get close to the dart point, I do like to stop and reduce my stitch length down to around like 1.5 or so. Because you're not back stitching at the end, this just helps to keep that dart point pretty secure. Make sure that you leave a long tail, because the last thing that you're going to do is you do need to tie a knot right there at the end of your dart point with those tails, just to make sure that it doesn't come unraveled. And the last thing that you need to do is just press your dart. So I like to use a tailor's ham for this, just because it's curved and kind of helps you avoid making your dart too pointy, but just give it some nice steam, press that excess down towards the hem. Next up, we're going to go ahead and prepare and sew our straps. So you're going to take your strap, and with right sides touching, you're going to fold it in half lengthwise. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we are going to sew that at a 1/2 an inch seam allowance. Make sure you back stitch at both ends just to keep it nice and tight so it doesn't unravel. Once you've sewn both of your straps in that way, you're going to trim off the seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch. And once you've done that, what we're going to do is we are going to turn it right sides out. So I do have this loop turner. You can also use a safety pin, whatever you prefer. But I find that these loop turners work really well. Once they're both turned right side out, you're going to go ahead and press them with lots of nice steam. I like to press them so that the seam is along one of the edges, but you can also do it so that the seam is along the back of each of your straps. So go ahead and take your front cami, and then you're going to pin each of your straps right sides together to the front of the cami at those dots. The raw edge of the strap is going to be flush with the top of that point on the front of your cami, and then we're going to go over to our machine and we're going to baste that strap in place at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance from the top. Now that the straps are securely in place, we're going to take our back cami and we're going to line up those raw edges of the side seams with right sides touching, and we're going to pin it down along that side seam. And we're going to do the exact same thing for the front and back lining pieces, right sides touching. And then we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we are going to stitch those side seams of both the lining and the main cami at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Don't forget that you need to backstitch at both the top and the bottom. Now we also need to finish those seam allowances so that they do not unravel. I'm going to be using my serger, but you can also use pinking shears, you can use French seams, you can use a zigzag stitch, whatever you prefer. Now the last thing that we need to do today is we need to press those seam allowances. So since I serged my seam allowances, I can only press them to one side. So I am going to press the seam allowances of my main cami towards the back. And then what I like to do is actually press the seam allowances then of the lining towards the front, so there's not so much bulk at that seam. If you are doing something like using pinking shears, you can go ahead and just press all of your seam allowances open. Okay, and that's it for today. Come back tomorrow and we will keep on sewing our Ogden cami.